So First Chronicles, we are in what's called the historical books of the Old Testament. If we were going to divide the Old Testament into four parts, you've got the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, or the 5 books of Moses. Then you've got the 12 historical books, and we're working our way through. We're right here, First Chronicles. Then you have the poetical books, and then you have the prophets, sometimes divided into major and minor prophets. So 4, or if you want to divide the prophets, 5 main sections. So, of course, these first 2 sections can all be put on a timeline. From Genesis all the way through to the book of Esther, you could put it on a timeline, one after the other. And then you could take the poetical books and drop them in, the Psalms, the prophetical books, drop them in, the prophecies. But that's our basic timeline. So we're coming to the end, almost towards the end of the timeline. The last books after Chronicles is just Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And that's the timeline finished, and 400 years before the New Testament. So we're coming to the end of our Old Testament history. So we studied 1st and 2nd Kings together, and of course we see that together that covers David and Solomon and takes us into the history of Israel and Judah, the United Kingdom, not our United Kingdom, but of Israel, the divided kingdom, and then the surviving kingdom of Judah is covered in the timeline of the Kings. So if we looked at a quick outline of that in the book of Kings, 1 Kings 1 to 11 would be where you have the United Kingdom. That means under Saul, David and Solomon. Before the kingdom split under Solomon's son, you had the United Kingdom. It's about 120 years or so. Then you had the divided kingdom. Solomon's son Rehoboam, you can read it in 1 Kings 12, that incredible story. The kingdom divides, and from that time on, in the book of Kings, we have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And when you read and study Kings, it's important to know that. Otherwise you get a bit confused. You read about the king of Israel and then the king of Judah. Unless you understand what the divided kingdom is, it's hard to follow. And I like to think of it in a way that the camera of focus is going up to the north, and then it looks at a couple of kings, and it goes back down to the south, looks at a couple of kings, and it goes up and down as it's following 2 parallel timelines. And then 2 Kings 18 is when the Assyrian captivity takes place in the north, and you have the southern kingdom surviving about another 150 years after the north. And that's before the Babylonian captivity. So all of this is about 400 years or so. This diagram, we looked at this before. This basically just gives us a picture of what we just said. So there's the United Kingdom. And then it divides. From that time on, you have the northern kingdom, which is referred to as Israel. The southern kingdom referred to as Judah. The north survives up to here until the Assyrian power. And then Judah up until Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian captivity, which was in 3 stages, 605, 597 and 586 was the final destruction of the temple and the deportations. And then, of course, you have our last 3 historical books on the end. This is just putting it all in a context for us. So that's just another diagram showing us the same thing. There you have the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. And this was the chart that we used to just follow through the kings. I like this chart because it shows you the north, shows you the south. There were 19 kings in total in the north. 9, do you say dynasties or dynasties? Dynasties, thank you. 9 dynasties, which means it was one family and his son reigned and his son reigned, and then another family came in and killed him and they reigned. So there were 9 different dynasties in the north, all bad eggs in the north. No good kings, no reformers. It was a bit of a sad spiral of sin and rebellion, and one seemed to just get worse than the other. And in fact, that statement is used. And he did more to provoke God than the Ahab, etc. In the south, also 19 kings, easy to remember, 19 and 19, plus 1 king, plus 1 queen, who wasn't a good queen. She was Athaliah, not a good queen either. But in the south, only 1 dynasty, and that's the dynasty of Judah. It's the line of David. this red line here representing following the messianic line through the Davidic covenant all the way to Christ coming in the New Testament. He was a king, of course, after the tribe of Judah. So in the south, only one dynasty, that's the line of David, 19 kings, one queen, and actually there were several good kings in there. I think it's about 8 who can be considered good. 4 of them particularly were reformers, who were not only good, but they took down the idolatry and things like that. So, and that takes us up until the captivity, which of course, according to Jeremiah's prophecy, was 70 years captive. And then, after that captivity, we have the 3 returns under these 3 men, Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Now, we're particularly interested in Ezra because Ezra was the author of Chronicles. He obviously wrote the book of Ezra, and he wrote the book of Chronicles for a certain purpose. So we're particularly interested in Ezra. And if you look at how the book of 2 Chronicles ends, and of course in the Hebrew Bible, Chronicles is one book. So if you look at how Chronicles ends and how Ezra begins, they're exactly the same verses. Ezra is purposely recording the history in Chronicles, and then he writes his book of Ezra, and they are joined. They are connecting. It's a fluid move from Chronicles into Ezra. So you could if this is a timeline, and you put all of the books on the timeline, Kings and Chronicles overlap. And we'll explain, the purpose of today is to help us see what's the difference between Kings and Chronicles. If they overlap and they cover the same time, why do we have the books of Kings and the books of Chronicles? What is the purpose there? And there are certain books in the Old Testament that were written to encourage the returning remnant. Those who did return under Zerubbabel and then Ezra and Nehemiah, there are certain books that when they would read them, it would encourage them in their faith and in the decisions of faith that they have made. Those books are Chronicles, which we're looking at now, of course the book of Ezra, Nehemiah, and then the last 3 prophetical books of that time, Haggai, Zechariah, and the Italian prophet Malachi. So why do we have the book of Chronicles? This is the question. What is it that is so unique about Chronicles that God would see it fit through inspiration to give us a second history covering the same timeline as the book of Kings? It's a similar question to why we have 4 Gospels cover the same timeline, but very different in their purpose and message. The book of John alone, 90% of John is unique to John. And we remember, because we studied it in church, we remember his statement of writing at the end of the book. He says, many other signs Jesus did, but these are that are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may know Jesus is the Christ, etc. So many things that are not written, so there's purposed omission, but these are written, that's purposed inclusion, that you may know. So it's selective, very selective, the history for John's purpose, and it's the same with Chronicles. Ezra could say, many other things that are written, that happened, that are not written in my book of Chronicles, but these are written so that, and that's the question, what is the so that? What's the purpose? What is Ezra's message through his unique book? And if we look at the focus of the return, why did God have his people return in the first place? Why did God, through Zerubbabel and Ezra, have the return? And we could give a few main reasons. Of course, the rebuilding of the temple, which had been destroyed. But of course, it's not a building without a purpose. It has a very central spiritual purpose in the lives and the history and the calling, if you like, of God's people. So rebuild the temple, also to restore temple worship through the sacrifices, through the feasts, etc., and to reinstate the priesthood, that the priesthood would be functioning, and to keep people separate. We know Ezra had to, we had a message recently about Ezra coming back to that situation where the people had intermarried. Again, the same sin that had contributed to their idolatry and then being taken into captivity in the first place is repeating, and Ezra can't believe what's happening. So part of his purpose of writing Chronicles is that the people would see the need for them to be set apart as God's people and revive people in their faith. So when we see those purposes for the return, we can begin to understand the purpose of Ezra finding the need to write the book of Chronicles in the first place. So it's written for the remnant, for those who had returned and perhaps those who still may return, following generations, that they were God's people, that you are the remnant, you are God's people. Do you know who you are? Don't forget that. Keep it close to your hearts. And to remind them of the covenant that he had made to them through Abraham. An unconditional covenant that was the very reason they weren't disqualified because of their sin. They were certainly disciplined, those generations in the captivity, but God never forsook Israel entirely. He fulfilled his promise in bringing them back. And Ezra's writings wants to say, listen, you are the apple of God's eye. He has not forsaken you. He has not forgotten you. He has never left you. His covenant is unconditional. It is based on his hesed, which is the word translated loving kindness or steadfast love or mercy in the Old Testament. Over 200 times, maybe 250 times, I think, in the Old Testament alone. Echoes all the way through the book because God's whole relationship with Israel wasn't based on the Mosaic law. There were conditions to the Mosaic law of them staying in the land and enjoying their relationship. But in terms of God fulfilling his covenant to them, it was all based on grace, certainly.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
You said a few minutes ago that God didn't forsake Israel in their captivity. Perhaps I'm thinking, and I've got it the wrong way around, but I thought Israel was dispersed and Judah went into captivity.
Yes. Yeah, there's questions surrounding that because, of course, in the Assyrian captivity there was a dispersion. In the deportation of Assyria, the tribes were dispersed, and how many of them found themselves back in Jerusalem, particularly the capital, and back down in the south later, we don't really know. But we know in terms of him fulfilling his ultimate promise and covenant, which involves the land and the people ultimately, and the coming of the Messiah, that is still completely held true. And we know in the future prophecies, although today we can't identify all 12 tribes, God certainly knows who they are. And the 144,000 that's prophesied in Revelation 7, for example, Jew might not know what tribe he is now. I think Levi is the only one that can really be identified today. Although some Jews may have the name Judah, their surname may be Judah. So, but God knows. So, yeah. Okay, so Ezra wants the people to see the key to their blessing and walking with God. If you walk with God, he will bless you. If you turn away from him, you will be disciplined. Not forsaken, but you will be disciplined as before. So, if we think of Kings and Chronicles, we hold these two books up to each other, and we want to understand what the difference is. So first of all, Kings was written after the final collapse of Jerusalem, after the Babylonian captivity, but before the return. Notice that. So it was after the captivity, so it was into the 70 years, but it was before the return. Chronicles was written by Ezra after the return. And it certainly has that emphasis. So you could say the book of Kings was written to show those in captivity how you got there. Here I am, I'm a Jew, I'm taken captive, I'm in Babylon. Why am I here? Read the book of Kings. The book of Kings shows you reap what you sow, you didn't listen to the prophets, you continued in your disobedience, and now you're a captive in Babylon. But now I'm a remnant Jew in Jerusalem, and I'm asking, how did I get here? My great-great-grandfather returned with Ezra, and here I am in the land. How did this happen? Read the book of Chronicles and see that it was by God's covenant, God's grace that brought you back to the land. So same history, but different emphasis, different message. You could liken it to Psalm 137, which is, by the rivers of Babylon we sat down, we hung up our harps, we could not sing the Lord's song, etc., weeping, oh, how did we get in the land of captivity? Versus Psalm 126, which says, we rejoice when God brought us back to Israel. This is Kings and Chronicles. So, if we put those contrasts on the screen for a moment, Kings written after the captivity to show how they got into captivity. Show them that they got what they deserved. Chronicles written after the return to show them how the return happened and that they got what they did not deserve. One shows you reap what you sow, and the other shows that you reap what you don't sow. That's called grace. Shows what if you want to be ripped out of the land again, this is what you do. This is the message of Kings. If you want to stay in the land, this is what you do. Read the book of Chronicles. So if we did a quick outline of the book of Chronicles, it's something like this. These chapters together. We can see First Chronicles, the first 9 chapters are genealogies, which for us as 21st century Gentile believers are maybe not so interesting. But in the mind of Ezra, the priest, in his writing and the history of Jerusalem, these genealogies are inspired and they serve a crucial purpose. And we'll have a look at what that is in just a minute. The second portion, which is really the rest of Chronicles, 10 to 29, focuses in on David's reign, particularly showing him off as the king after God's own heart, his desire to build the temple, his victories, the glory of David's reign, leading us right into Solomon in the first part of 2 Chronicles, which we'll look at another time. And then the last, from chapter 10 to the end of 2 Chronicles, lists the kings of Judah. So, we'll look at the genealogies. Before we do that, I couldn't just skip over this. I have to mention this. Before we do that, let me stop. You may remember when we studied Genesis. In Genesis 5, there are 10, this is an aside, so just hit the pause. There are 10 patriarchs that are listed, 10 names spread apart all through chapter 5. And when you put those names together and find out the Hebrew meaning, you get a sentence which is essentially the gospel. It goes something like this. Adam's name means man, Seth means appointed, etc. So put it together and it's man is appointed to mortal sorrow. The blessed God shall come down teaching. His death shall bring the despairing comfort and rest. Now, what's interesting is in the first 10 words of 1 Chronicles 1 are those 10 names. If you look at 1 Chronicles 1, it's literally just Adam, Seth, Enosh. So there you can see that gospel in the Hebrew in the first 10 words, first 10 names of that genealogy. Incredible. Okay, we're back. Genealogy, chapters 1 to 9. What's unique about this genealogy, and you're not supposed to be able to read that, it's just a visual. What's unique about this chronology is it's a selective chronology. If you study a family tree, it's hard to follow every branch, right? And in the same way, Ezra has chosen this genealogy and he has purpose. There is a mission and selection and inclusion because he's taking us a certain direction. So the question should be, what is Ezra wanting to show us through this genealogy? And, of course, Adam's descendants are listed. But we know that Adam had Cain and Abel and Seth. But he doesn't mention Cain and Abel. He just follows the line of Seth. And he follows Seth down to Enoch and Noah's sons. But he doesn't follow all of Noah's sons. He just follows Shem. Because Shem was the ancestor of Abraham. And he follows Shem down to Abraham and down to the 12 sons. And he only follows the line of Judah and Levi. It's so insightful and so interesting because this is Ezra's message. What's important for him is the king and the priest. Judah and Levi. These two are the two that he follows. So it's so insightful to see that. And in the book of Chronicles, First Chronicles really deals with David, and Second Chronicles follows Judah, the kingly line. And this is Ezra's focus, the priesthood and the kingly line, all which are wrapped up in God's unconditional promise to Israel. So, there's a second history, we could say, in the book of Chronicles. We're beginning to see, as we're walking through this together, we're beginning to see some distinctions between Kings and Chronicles, and we want to highlight a few more. Here's some distinctions which help us frame the book. First of all, the genealogy is unique to Chronicles. 9 chapters. It can be your bedtime reading tonight. 9 chapters of just this genealogy. And again, so important for Ezra to highlight the root, the history, the ethnic separation of God's people all the way down to the kingly and the priestly line. Secondly, there's a real emphasis on David in the book. If Ezra in his message wanted to hold up the model king, although David certainly wasn't perfect, but he was a king who valued certain things, who had a heart for the temple to be built, etc. And the most important thing about David perhaps wasn't what it was his heart was the most important thing. That through the Psalms we see his relationship with God. There's a real focus on the temple. Many chapters that are amplified from the book of Kings to give us more information on the temple. This is a shocking one. Think of this. The hardships or the sins are not highlighted. What do we mean? Well, we remember when the early chapters of Samuel, we remember the sin with Bathsheba. We remember the conspiracy with Absalom and the incredible, all of that is omitted from Chronicles. Incredible. That's quite an omission, isn't it? You're tracing the history of David and you leave out all of that, all of the sin, all of the error, because that's not what Ezra is looking to highlight. He's wanting to highlight the glory, the grace, what grace produced. Not what man's sin and flesh produced, but what did grace produce in David's life? That's the focus. And here's a massive omission. For those of you who have studied Kings, perhaps this will be more significant, but the whole northern kingdom is omitted in Chronicles. Remember Kings, it gives us follows the northern timeline and the southern timeline. It's going back and forth between them. But Chronicles only follows the line of Judah in the south. Isn't that shocking? That's an incredible amount of chapters that are not alluded to. The only time you hear of, because you may read this and say, oh, wait a minute, I see a northern king mentioned. They're only mentioned if it's in relationship to an alliance or something, that a southern king is having an alliance with the northern king. But the camera, the focus, the history follows the messianic line of Judah only. Only follows David's line. Hesed, this word that we mentioned, this covenant love word, is only 4 times in the book of Kings, but 14 times in the book of Chronicles. Again, that's something that Ezra's really wanting to bring out. And the last 2 here, prophets. This is amazing. When you compare the 2, and what I did years ago, I have a Bible here, and what I did is it was a project of devotion. I thoroughly enjoyed it at the time, and I took a highlighter, and I went into the book of Chronicles, and I highlighted, you can see the green there, everything that's mentioned in Chronicles that is not mentioned in Kings. And that's where many of these insights came from. I began to realize, began to see certain things that Ezra is including to convey his message, to share with the remnant. Listen, if you want to be blessed in walking in the land, these are key important elements that you need to remember. So one thing that's included in the book of Chronicles, and this is so insightful, is that there are so many stories that are told, you could almost say, from a natural viewpoint, in the book of Kings, but when they're retold in the book of Chronicles, all of a sudden you see a prophet added. We'll go through it next week. You'll see the same event, and then it will say, and God sent a prophet who said to the king, don't do that. And the king says, oh, okay, I won't do that. But we didn't read that in Kings. Ezra wants to put into the message, it's so important how the king hears the prophet, responds to the prophet. And this is the last one, humility. How the king responded to the prophet was so crucial. And we have these incredible contrasts of certain kings who were, this was again, David sinned, but he was responsive to the prophet. When Nathan said, you are the man, he Psalm 51, etc. Saul, on the other hand, didn't hear Samuel. He had a different relationship with the prophet. That's something that Ezra really wants to bring out. So, we get the flavor a little bit. There it is. We get some of the distinctions. We see that we're beginning to see why we have the book of Chronicles as well as Kings. Because Ezra has a certain purpose, a certain message. The audience of the remnant, and we could say that folds right over to us as believers today, as those who are following Christ today. The message is the same. That the temple is in the center. That our priesthood is functioning, speaking of prayer. That our worship through the feast days are functioning, through our devotion and through our grace. That we are set apart people in this world system. The message folds right over to the 21st century. And Ezra wants to say, listen, if you want to be blessed, walking in the promises, these are the things you need to keep in the center. So, let's look at some of the rest of this history. We considered the first 9 chapters as the genealogy to show off the king and the priest. And chapter 10 has a word on King Saul. And what's incredible about this is Ezra's account of Saul is just about as brief as it could be. Remember, this was the first king who, we read that he was a head taller than the rest, but we don't read that he had a heart after God. He had a big head, but David had a big heart, and that's the most important thing. The first king is dismissed in, get this, 14 verses. Here's Ezra. You know what? I'm going to lay out the history from the most important perspective I can for the remnant believers. And this is what I'm going to say about Saul. 14 verses. This is what I'm going to say about David and the temple and the priesthood and his victories. There's a real difference in focus. And among those 14 verses, it's capped off with this. So Saul died for his unfaithfulness. He was unfaithful to the Lord, that he did not keep the command of the Lord, and consulted a medium, seeking guidance, and did not seek guidance from the Lord. Therefore the Lord slew him and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. Turn the page. That's it on Saul. Ezra is really trying to convey a message here. Listen, Saul is an example of what we don't want in our heart and in our lives, in our experience. He was a carnal, unbelieving, naturally minded, self-preserving man, and David had something that Saul didn't. We don't read the Psalms of Saul. We don't read about the mighty men of Saul, but we read about that of David, and that's what Ezra wants to show. He wants us to glean only certain truths from this history. Another emphasis is, of course, the ark being the centerpiece of the tabernacle. It's a wonderful emphasis of the book. The story of Uzzah touching the ark. Remember that story? We read it in 2 Samuel 6. When David, and he had the right desire, David said, okay, I want to bring the ark. I want to bring the ark to Jerusalem. But the way they brought the ark, they put it on a cart. It was clearly laid out in the law that only the Levites would bear the ark on the poles on their shoulders. It's a clear indication of the familiarity, even with David and others and the priesthood at the time. They weren't sharp in their convictions of the word and the law. They had become familiar, even learning from the Philistines, how to move the ark, because that's how the Philistines moved it. They put it on a cart. Israel did the same thing. And when Uzzah touched the ark, he was struck dead, right? Now, when you read the story in 2 Samuel 6, the original story of Uzzah touching the ark and then it going into the house of Obed-Edom, remember? Obed-Edom was blessed, and then David finally said, okay, let's bring it again. In Samuel it simply says, so they bear the ark, indicating the second time round the Levites carried it on the shoulders. But in Chronicles, Ezra gives several chapters, I think it's 3 whole chapters to this event of bringing the ark to Jerusalem. He opens up this insight in 1 Chronicles 15:1. David, when he says, let's bring the ark to Jerusalem, David says, listen, do I have everyone's attention? Listen, only the Levites are to touch the ark and to carry the ark because this is what the law said. Like David learned a valuable lesson. Ezra wanted to bring that out. He wanted to show, listen, do you see how instructive the story of Uzzah and Obed-Edom and David is? And in Chronicles chapter 15 verse 13, David says, we did not do it right the first time. Let's do it right the second time. And in verse 15 it says, so the Levites bore the ark on their shoulders. You see that? That helps us understand what Ezra's purpose is. He wanted to show the remnant, listen, there's a way that's right of doing things and a way that's wrong of doing things. We want to follow the Lord, follow the Word, and be precise in our faith. Not familiar, not casual, not carnally minded, thinking, well, it doesn't matter. As long as the ark gets from there to there, it's okay. No. God says, I have a way, I have an order by which you will honor me and the priesthood, and we do things decently and in order. And of course, the ark was brought to Jerusalem. This is also something that Ezra really highlights. Because remember, the tabernacle was in Gibeon. But David didn't say, okay, let's get the ark and let's bring it back to the tabernacle. He said, no, I want it in Jerusalem. Because he understood that that's where the city of the king would be. It was one of his first victories. From this point, that's where the ark will remain, in Jerusalem. In chapter 17, we read of David's desire to build the temple. So all through these chapters here, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17, we see David, the temple, the ark, the desire for the temple to be built. And then in chapters 18 through 20, we read of David's victories. This is after the ark is now in Jerusalem. We read about David's victories recorded. And again, these are amplified. These are highlighted in Ezra's amplified history. He wants to show them, listen, when the ark is in its place, when it's in Jerusalem, and when the heart is right with God, victory will follow. And that's what happened with David. Now, there is one sin that is mentioned of David in the book of Chronicles, and it's the sin of numbering the people. And it should raise the question, well, why is it that Ezra left out all the other sins and problems in David's reign, but he included this one? And it's because the other sins, although certainly a lot of people got hurt because of them, and there was strife in the kingdom because of it, that was related to David's personal sin as a man. But this related to David as a sin, as a leader, as a king, in numbering the people and putting his confidence in the numbers of men rather than in the Lord. So, because of that sin, God gave David 3 choices. He said you can have 3 years of famine, 3 months of being oppressed by your enemies, or 3 days of plague. And David says, I put myself in the hands of your mercy, you decide. So God brought a pestilence on them. And during that, God said to David, I want you to go and build an ark on the threshing floor of Ornan, which, by the way, is where the temple would be built. It's incredibly significant that God actually chose the place where the temple would be built in this event here. And then, of course, we again just echo the desire of David for the building of the house, understanding that for God to be in the center was so important. But God, of course, wanted a man of peace to build the temple, not a man of war. So he said, your desire is good, but David, you won't build my house, I will build your house. And there he was speaking not of a literal house, but his lineage, his descendants. He was echoing the Davidic covenant, which was the response. But I will let your son build the house. However, although David didn't actually build the house, God allowed him to make much of the preparation for it. And we read of this in chapter 22, 23 and on. We see God allowing David to prepare and help design the furniture and collect the materials. He dug up rock, he gathered gold and silver. It says that David gathered it all, but Solomon was to build it. And then the final chapters, which is really 23 to 29, it focuses on David organizing the kingdom with the little overlap between him and Solomon. David organizing the Levites and the leaders, and then it closes out. And we'll pick up in 2 Chronicles, where it really kicks off following the line from Solomon to his son Rehoboam, and then only following the line of Judah. And what we'll look at next week is we'll look at some of the inclusions or additions that Ezra makes with some of those kings and the messages each one has for the remnant and for us. Each one of those kings of Judah, each one is like a little sermon in itself, so instructive. So the message of Chronicles for us is the same. We have our throne, if you like, our sphere of influence. We have our will and our freedom of choice. And God says, just like a king sitting on a throne in his kingdom, also the king was to be subject to God, to God's throne, to God's word, to God's authority. Same with us as believers. That's what it means that we would take up our cross. We would be submitted to him in humility. We would be spirit-filled every day. We would also have the desire and the purpose devotion that Christ would be at the center, that the ark would be at the center, that Christ would be the center of our worship, that the priesthood would be functioning, that there will be praise and worship in our life as a spirit-filled believer, and we will be set apart unto God. And just as Israel was to be a nation, that the other nations would look at Israel and say, well, the God of Israel is the true God, and be drawn as a testimony, although that wasn't always the case. It's the same with us and with the church. Again, it may not always be the case, but that's the design, the model, that the church, people would see the church and they would see that there is something that the church has that the world doesn't, and that they would be drawn to know the true God as we do. So, Father, we thank you for this time in the book of 1 Chronicles and the instruction for our spiritual lives. And thank you for giving us some time and focus, some handles that we can have on this book to see where it fits in the canon, in the Old Testament. And we just pray you'd hide these things in our hearts in Jesus' name. Amen.